English are not indigenous or something, the implication for the reader, they're not native or they don't have a connection to a history there.
I'm Sam, and this is Illegitimate Scholar, a weekly anthropology podcast that operates outside of the restrictions of mainstream academia. Here we make sense of our senseless world through open discussion of difficult and taboo topics and a love of the human spirit. Today, I talk to Nordhugr, who makes Nordic diaspora cultural content. We discuss the differences between the Nordic and Irish diaspora, the politics and history of indigenous people, and studying the past to adapt to the future.
You can find me here on YouTube at Nordhugr, history, philosophy, lore. That's what I cover on my channel. Big emphasis on Northern European history, but obviously interested in stuff all around that. So I'm kind of branching out this year pretty aggressively into the documentary space, experimenting more with taking the filmmaking side of things more seriously. But yeah, just so glad. Thanks for having me on this podcast, Sam. We Scandis have to revive our culture. Us diaspora, we've lost touch. We're kind of fading away here right now. So we gotta relink with our bros across the sea. We gotta revive our culture, our traditions. We're gonna bring it back. We're gonna have a lively cultural scene. So that's kind of my long-term vision. So we're gonna make that happen.
No, I think that's I think that's awesome, dude. I think that is something that feels like something that is happening in general in 2023. It feels like a revival of localism. I mean, right now, so it's January 29th. This episode is not going to drop for a little while, but like right now, what happened yesterday, and some people might not have heard about this, but Ilhan Omar, who is a U.S. Congresswoman, is in Congress, talking about herself, as what did she say? In a Somali first and a Muslim second, not even bringing up being American. I don't know if she thought it was implied, but like, unless she comes out and says like, oh, I'm an American, then like we have to assume even she is open about the fact that she's not pushing for being an American. And I understand that. I think that traditionally a lot of people, a lot of mostly liberals would view me making a statement like that as like, oh, you're questioning her loyalty. It's like, yeah, practically we have a lot of people whose their loyalty is not in line with being an American, and I have myself included with that. Like, I see the writing on the wall and understand that, like, okay, localism is coming out, localism and tribalism towards a different identity. For me, it's being Irish American. And again, I'm 3/4 Irish. I worry about people in other parts of the country that don't have like a direct link, because that's true of a lot of like, a lot of people are just white mutts, and my kids might be, unless I marry an Irish woman. But it's like, it's something that's naturally coming about in our culture right now, is that people are moving back into lower forms of identity, which is very bad, and something we've talked about here for the continuity of the country. And for the identity of being an American, but that's been specifically under attack for a long time.
I think the part of the point is what is being lost, and I think when my ancestors came to the U.S., for instance, it's like, well, we were coming to assimilate into, largely because we needed to find some place other than Norway and Sweden, because there were too many children at the time. It was during the Industrial Revolution. We were running out of farmland. So only, the firstborn son or a couple of the kids could inherit the farmland. And you couldn't divide the farmland so much every single generation. You'd run out of farmland. Everyone would starve. And, Irish have similar experiences with, agriculture issues leading to migration.
The Irish land was owned by absentee landlords, and it was another thing. But similar issue, yeah.
Yeah, basically too many people, not enough food. Got to find some place to move to. And part of the whole project of assimilation in the, both the 19th and the first half of the 20th century was this idea that, okay, well, new immigrants are coming in from Europe, and okay, we'll assimilate to Anglo culture. The Anglos have built this really successful, and you could say Anglo-British culture, built this really successful model, and they have, it's relatively similar to Nordic culture as well. So there's a fair amount of crossover. It's like, all right, we're gonna go to our cousin's place, we're gonna behave by their rules, we're gonna get along with them. Yeah. But ultimately, what happened is Anglo culture fell apart. So it's like, well, what are we assimilating to now? It's like, is it really, is the deal still on? If it's like the agreement is okay, we come and we're going to be good British, English cultural citizens and assimilate like the rest of you guys. But now, wait, where did English culture go? Where did this sort of English America go? And it's like, well, that doesn't really exist anymore. So
Right.
by going back to some of our older traditions and looking back to those, it's like the mythology that we have, the stories that we have, the culture, the traditions, the rituals, all of these things are a form of technology. They're psychological technology or psychotechnology you could
Absolutely.
call it. And
Yeah.
it's like these elements, these traditions, these ways of being that are particular to wherever you came from, they've developed over thousands of years, and they've developed in a particular way that equips people to live in a healthy, high trust society.
Hmm.
So, by going back to some of those older traditions, when it's like, okay, well, maybe for some people that is English culture or English tradition, it's like maybe that is the best set of cultural tools that you can go towards and look to for guidance. In my case, it's like, well, it makes more sense because all my ancestors are either from Sweden or Norway. So it's like, well, I'll look back to those traditions and look back to those ways of life, those ways of being, the stories that kind of forged us, what's our history, and then kind of realizing too, it's like, okay, well, my history, it's it's this much American history, like the last 100 to 150 years as American history, and then it's like there's 10,000 years below that of much older, Scandinavian tradition going back to the Western hunter gatherers, Indo-Europeans. So
Right.
it's tying back to that history that's a lot more primal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of like, people adopt a new okay, so when we say go back to ancient traditions, I think one of the key things is that it's not necessarily it is going back, but it's going back and borrowing. And then culture, one of the key definitions of culture, at least in anthropology, is that it changes over time. So naturally it's always changed in relation to how people and the culture in aggregate responds to the physical and the human environment, which is also dynamic. It also changes. So whenever you have like going back to something because whatever you have isn't working, and I would say that what we have in American culture is not working, you have an adoption of old technology. In this case, yeah, I like what you said about them being psychotechnologies. They are practical in a lot of ways. For example, like I just had a talk with a guy who was talking about the Mayan influences on the Mississippi mound builder culture. I have that episode coming out soon. It's going to be its own thing. Um, and though the technologies that they adopted, the rituals that they adopted were in line with them producing corn as their main subsistence source. And that's a very literal example because it has to do with food production, but it also has to do with like, in the United States, we have this massive issue, especially with younger people and increasing with mental health issues. And like that is culturally determined by the culture that we have. But when you have a culture that isn't working, where people are upset, where like people are having mental health problems, there's economic issues, there's extreme economic issues, then it makes sense to go back to think that what you're doing is not working and what can you do again that is going to work. And a lot of times that has to do with going back to how people did things in the past. And I fully agree. And I think that what we're going to have to do is understand things that happened in the past and relate them to the environment that we have today. And I think that a lot of that will, and it is being pursued right now. It's being pushed in colleges. Like when I was in education college, we had an entire class that was like about cultural responsivity, and it mostly had to do with non-white people, but it was explicit that it was about white people as well. I mean, my professor did say that, like it's like white people do have culture, like they do. And
Yeah, yeah.
number one, there's the white American culture broadly, but then there's these distinct subcultures, like Irish, and like Nordic, and you can I'm talking too much. I'm done. Yeah.
No, those are all really great points.
Yeah,
And
I appreciate that, but yeah, I was then going to start rambling even more. So
yeah, in this uncovery process, if you do decide to go through it on some level, it's like, it is kind of LARPy too. In some ways, it's like that's fine. It's part of the process. You kind of LARP your way into making things happen. So
yeah,
like with my
you gotta
channel,
fake
for
it till you make
instance,
it.
exactly. Like with my channel, for instance, I make content on history. I make content on culture, not anthropology, but um,
You do.
basically
I
history,
mean,
philosophy,
yeah.
yeah, mythology. So I guess there's crossover with anthropology, but it's
All these okay, so I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but like that's the thing. It's like anthropology, it's such like the four subfields are archaeology, cultural anthropology, physical or biological anthropology, and the other one, linguistics. So they overlap with basically every other field. It's like very few people actually explicitly say that they do anthropology. Like that's why I do it as a
yeah.
niche because I specifically love it. But everybody has overlap. Everybody has overlap, and you specifically do a lot of things that like everything you do could be described as anthropology. I think. But
That's
sorry.
good. I mean, that's a fair point. And I make this content around these subjects, but I'm by no means a historian. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a scholar. So I'm
Neither am
maybe
I.
an illegitimate scholar. But it's like I don't consider myself a historian. I don't have a super in-depth knowledge on all of the subjects that my channel revolves around. So when I take a topic, I'll go topic by topic or story by story, and it's just kind of a process of I'm learning these things as I go through them on the channel, and we're kind of learning as we go through this process together. So with each video, I'll take a particular subject and I'll just try to deep dive and research as thoroughly as I possibly can on that specific element, create that piece of content, put it out, and then learn by kind of going topic by topic. So I don't ever want to, come across on my channel as though, I'm some super authoritative expert. I'm just kind of making these are exploratory projects. It's exploratory work as I'm going into this. So sometimes I get details wrong, or I kind of as I'm going. It's like it's a and for specific videos, I try to put huge amounts of time and study into specific topics when I'm researching them, but it's one of those things that I'm sure you've experienced all the time, where it's like the more you study something and the more you learn about it, the more you realize you only know a fraction of you only know the top of the iceberg, and there's
Right.
so much, and every piece of content and every topic is so interconnected with everything else. When you're talking about a particular city, well, that's tied into its archaeological history, that's tied into its language, that's tied into histories of its genetic populations, that's tied into um, artwork, that's tied into trade
Yeah.
lanes and its economics. So there's so many layers to anything, and everything is so interconnected that there's no not like a there's no one on earth who's a historian capital H who knows everything about every subject. So it's a process of just kind of picking something, trying to explore it as much as you can, and then moving on to the next thing. And hopefully people enjoy that process, the process of just kind of learning as I'm learning. And my goal is to try to make this stuff more participatory. So it's not just me. It's like we're just coming together and exploring things that we find fascinating and valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so this is something that I've talked about a number of times. So like, you know, there's some things that are innate, and I would sometimes call them innate or divine. And there's categories that are innate, and then they have their categories of social construction. And social construction tends to be a dirty word for conservatives, but a lot of what I do is bring the good methods of cultural anthropology and of anthropology in general to a conservative audience because they are useful. So when conservatives hear the word social construct or they hear the word cultural relativity, which are two that I use a lot, I've done this several times. I've done it with Pete Quinones. I've done it with the good old boys. Like something that's a social construction is something that's human created, and even
Yep.
language is a social construction. So the way that we're talking right now in English, and you know, and neither of us are genetically English, but I mean, we both probably have a tiny little bit of it just because of movement. But there's when something's a social construction, it's gone through the lens of man, which makes it away from being perfect, right? So like it can't be 100% true. It has a level of distortion by being it's like a cheesecloth where like there's some coming out of it, right? It's like you have a little leakage. So when we're talking about studying the study of history, the word history and the field of history, and then your own perceptions of that history, they're all social constructions. They're all things created in the minds of man, rather than like the minds of something divine and innate. So they're all it's always there's always bias to it. There's always complete bias to it. And anyone who tells you there isn't is if someone tells me that their take is completely unbiased, it's essentially to me the same as saying that they're God. And that's not true. And anyone who's saying that should get their ass kicked. And I mean that. I mean,
yeah. And like when someone says, or when you say social construction, or this is socially constructed, or you use one of these terms, and I'm sure it's a lot of the conservatives go, they kind of hear it's like, oh, this is like libtard coded language,
right? Because they have a preconception of that.
Yeah. But can I put a counterpoint to language in particular being a social construction? Because
I mean, you can. You'd be wrong by the time, but yeah,
sure,
go ahead.
For sure. There's an idea both in scripture, in religion, and in Germanic mythology as well that language, there is something about language that exists before and above man. So, for instance, you know, Christ is the Logos, he's the Word manifested. There is this idea that God spoke the world into being. So there is this God ordained language that is before man and prior to man. And there's also this idea that, like Odin, for example, he's trying to figure out the mysteries of the runes. And the runes are a little more complicated than just language. Runes are kind of a messy subject. But even Odin being, you know, the father of the gods, he's not privy to all the details. There's something pre-existing or above him and beyond him that he needs to sacrifice himself to attain that runic knowledge. So there's an idea that there is something about language which is prior to man or removed from man, that, you know, much in the way that mathematics, you could say, exists outside and independent of man, but man can tap into it and uncover its mysteries. That there is an idea that language is similar. Now, granted, though, it is true that we have to come to agreements on the meanings of terms. We can say, okay, blue means this, but we could also change that and say, actually, blue means something totally different. We could collectively come together and change that. That's kind of my counterpoint. That's more of a philosophical idea, though. But I mean, in terms of practical day to day.
Yeah, I don't necessarily even view what you just said as a counterpoint. I'd say I probably agree with that. Like, but in practicality, when we're speaking English, it's a social construct. So yes, they're you know, that could be true. It's kind of one of those unprovable, which puts it in the realm of what I would call, at least in anthropology, it would be in the realm of the religious. It's unverifiable as well as you can't disprove it and you can't prove it. So it's like it goes in that realm. So I would say, okay, like I like that idea, but when we're talking in English, like maybe that language exists, English isn't it. I'm 100% sure of that. Definitely not English, because English is a Frankenstein language.
King James, back when Saint Pastor John in 480 AD was martyred by the Romans, God came down, handed him the King James Bible, and then he took that and then passed the good word of the King James. That is the text in English.
If you're hearing this and you don't know, that did not happen. That did not happen at all.
What?
No, the
I've been fact checked here.
Yeah,
It's over.
yeah.
I'm canceled now.
You couldn't you couldn't get that past me. Now, okay, but language. So once we start, like, when you try to describe something, it's like the language, the way that you, like, the different language that you speak is a manifestation of your particular culture. So one of the biggest, like, I talk about this all the time, that adopting the language of someone else is the
I'm interrupting myself to tell you that my Patreon is $2 a month right now. All the episodes are early and unedited. Episode 54 is up there with Basil, Neobactrian already. And that includes a 30-minute discussion about trans people and their issues that I won't be putting on YouTube at all. That episode is actually free fully right now, regardless. Link is in the description.
Language is the largest defense of a culture. Like, if you take an extreme example, everybody has heard that the Inuit have like 40 words for snow. It's like, yeah, because of course they have 40 words for snow, because they live in the snow. And the different types of snow, you know, everybody knows there's different types of snow. There's like sleet at the extreme end that's almost rain. There's powdery snow. There's thick, deep snow. There's snow that's melted and it's almost icy. There's just literal ice if it melts and refreezes immediately. It's like, so the Eskimos who hunt in the snow and have to not get lost in a white wilderness and die like a terrible death freezing out there, they have to know different types of snow because it has practical implications for their lives. Just like we have practical implications for all these words that, like, that exist in our life. How would I explain what to today a lot of tribes people in Papua New Guinea do know what smartphones are. In fact, some of them have them. But transport back in time 200 years, I try to explain what a smartphone is to a ship captain from England. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to end up burned. Or, like, if they're on the ocean, they're not going to burn me. They're going to throw me off. Like, I'm going to be a sorcerer.
Make you walk the plank. It's going to happen.
Seriously. And I'm not kidding. Like, they would literally probably kill you because it would be in the realm of witchcraft. Which, you know, still has things going on today. But it's these words make sense a lot. Like, if you want to understand it, go to the extreme ends and think about something like a smartphone in a population 200, 300 years ago. But there's always a level of discontinuity between how people define words, because words do change in definition over time. And like you said, they can collectively change. But a lot of times there's a concept I've been talking about all the time in anthropology, which is hierarchical diffusion. And a lot of times what happens is these words and definitions are changed from the top down. Hierarchical diffusion, they happen from the top down. It's not from a collective decision. It's something like somebody decides that the word Latin X is what they're going to call Hispanic people now. And then even though most Hispanic people don't believe that term or have even heard of it, it ends up being the word that's used to describe Hispanic or Latino people in colleges. Like, I mean, I experienced this personally. I thought everyone was crazy because they were saying it. And I had a Gallup poll pulled up that showed only 4% of Hispanic people use it. And Hispanic is the preferred term. But they would call me using Hispanic. It would be like a faux pas. It would be like something you can't do. I did it, but I was 4 years older than everybody else and angry and didn't care if nobody liked me because they didn't. But, like, most people respond to social pressure in a way like that. So through social pressure from, like, people at the top, it comes down. And that means that people can change definitions of words to be in line with how they want the world to be perceived. They can change, like, and how people react to situations. This is why you're not allowed to say illegal immigrants in pleasant company. You have to say freaking, what do they like to say? Undocumented. Oh, undocumented. It's euphemisms. It's all euphemisms. Because that changes the way that people view situations. You can't say illegal immigrant. You have to say undocumented. You can't say you can't say baby murder. You have to say abortion because it sounds better. And if you say baby murder, people will treat you like you don't believe in women's rights.
I'm curious in comparing what's your experience in the Irish diaspora versus my experience in the Scandi diaspora? Because from what I've gathered from talking to, you know, my Irish American bros versus my Scandi American bros, the Irish have been consistently a lot more connected to their cousins across the Atlantic, whereas, like, with us Scandis, there's a little bit of communication, continuously, but it's not much. And it's, unless and there's not many recent Scandi immigrants, there's a few, but the Irish, it's been more of a continuous flow, or there've been a few different, waves. Is that the case?
Right. So I mean, so I'm from southern New England. I'm from a county that Irish ethnically is the largest population. And I'm from a place where like there are a lot of people that are like full or half or more Irish. So it's like and then yes, there is the thing that there was Irish immigration continuing until about like until the 1920s and even later. Like there is more of a connection. There's also I don't know how the Nordic diaspora is with this, but like my uncles are in Irish American fraternal organizations. There's the Knights of Columbus, as well
Mm.
as the Knights of Columbus, the and the Ancient Order of the Hibernians. So I think that there's more stuff that is a connection that a lot of it is distinctly Irish American, but a lot of it is connections with both. There's also more media, I think, and I think that like I can only speak of my experience, but I'm from New England. I'm from a place like I'm like Boston Irish, so like I'm from a place that has
Yeah.
a lot of representation in media. I feel like there's a lot more Irish American and Irish diaspora content than there is. We have like I have Mark Wahlberg. Like Mark Wahlberg's my
Mm.
guy, right? Like it's like I
Yeah.
don't think that you guys have that, or I don't think you guys have that at a similar level.
Yeah, not
Irish
to the
American
same level.
Festival,
Yeah.
yeah, but you do live in an area with but like maybe is there stuff that I don't know about because like I wouldn't know.
There are, some fraternal organizations. They're not particularly, I don't know, a lot of them are in kind of rough shape. And then we have a couple institutes. There's like a Swedish institute, a Norwegian institute. They're they're decently well funded and supported. And there are some of these organizations where there are these kind of cultural institutes, but they tend to be pretty shallow in terms of, and I don't want to bash them too much, but they're they tend to be kind of lacking in having any profound reason for why you should care if you are part of the diaspora. They're just kind of like, oh, it's a
Oh,
nice thing if you're in it, and also, oh yeah, go ahead.
no, that's it, dude. That's a big one I didn't say. Like all the other things are huge. We have like Boston Irish is a thing. We have all these movies that are directly like we got something silly like Boondock Saints. We got stuff like The Town. Like Boston Irish stuff like exists everywhere, and
Right,
it's great and broadly Irish American. But dude, the whole like Irish
plastic
American
Irish.
what?
Is that the term? The term I've heard is plastic Irish.
Oh, yeah. So plastic patty is a term
Plastic.
that like a lot of Irish people will use to make fun of Irish Americans. But number one, I think they're doing one of two things. It's like they're making fun of somebody who has like 1/8, like one great grandfather that was Irish, and they don't know anything about Irish American, and then they just like, oh yeah, I'm Irish, like on St. Patrick's Day and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, because
I
it's
think
like
they're
exotic.
yeah, I think they're generally not talking about people like me that have like legitimate connections to it,
Yeah.
but who like, but I never experienced that. I never experienced like being called a plastic patty or being like made fun of for it from anyone who's a conservative Irish person. It's
Mm.
only the liberals. It's like a liberal
Interesting.
Irish person who's like,
Yeah.
oh, you're fake. And the reason is because number one, they don't care about ethnicity and they don't care about the traditions. But these are the same types of people who would consider like an immigrant dropping out of from Algeria or not or Algeria, Nigeria, the different places coming to Ireland, and then they'd be like, oh yeah, they're Irish because they have a passport.
Hmm.
But then the conservatives. So I've never experienced anything like that from conservatives. But yeah, that is an insult, plastic patty, for somebody who's like fake. But it doesn't really apply to me because it's like it's
You're too
I'm pretty
real, and real recognizes real.
yeah, yeah. I really only care about the opinions of the conservatives anyway. But the thing is, dude, like eh, so Ireland is now like a pretty decently well off country, but that wasn't true for a long time.
Mm.
Um, like the Irish
So they probably
diaspora.
they didn't want to cut off their diaspora if their diaspora is a lot more wealthy than they are, I would imagine. Back
Well,
then.
so the thing is right. So there was something, there were issues in Ireland forever. There still are. But like there were major issues, and a lot of people fled Ireland, came to America, maybe not, they were economic migrants in the sense that they were coming for an economic life, but there was, so there's in emigration, there's push and pull factors. Push factors are what pushes you away from your homeland. Pull factors is what brings you somewhere else. And the push factors from Ireland were huge because they were fleeing a genocide famine for a long time. So it was like, it wasn't like leave for a better life. It was like leave or die, which I think is a bigger push factor. And when you have an emigration of a population that has more of these push factors, it means that it takes people who, if it were a little bit better off, they might not even leave. They don't really want to leave as much. Whereas with your population, you had only people that wanted to leave, or more
Well,
so of that.
that's I would actually I would say it's more actually similar to the Irish in that most of the people who came to America, some of them did want to come, but I mean most of it was that they basically their options were either go to America or be totally destitute and maybe
Right.
starve
Right. So
because there just wasn't land. So
I
you would
totally,
have like an acre and try to sustain yourself and a family on like 1 acre of land. It's like that's not gonna happen.
yeah. I think like, and yes, that is true. And there were a lot of Irish people that left for America and Canada who that was true for. But a larger proportion of the Irish population left. So I think that you have like that same
Yep.
population, there's
Yep.
comparable. And then there's additional people who, if their circumstances were the same, they they wouldn't have left. Like the situation was bad in Scandinavia at the time. The situation was worse in Ireland. So you have
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
do have a higher percentage of the population leaving. But also like there's the famine, there's a long history of the diaspora from the 1860s from Ireland helping the homeland, like a long history. And that
So I
was in,
almost spilled my drink.
yeah, no worries. That continued into the 70s and the 80s, like the troubles. There was a lot of American support for the troubles from the diaspora, and I think that having something like that, having something serious happening back in your homeland or your fatherland, whatever, motherland, then I think that creates, I mean, it literally creates continued economic ties. There were those because of that. And with those economic ties comes a greater, it comes like real tie, like economic ties creates real like emotional ties, I guess.
Oh,
Like,
for
I mean,
sure. For sure.
my mother is 100% Irish. She has 3 Irish names, which I'm not going to share on the podcast, but like, and she's, I think that one of her grandparents was full Irish. Like some of my descendants are from like the mid 1800s, but there's still continuity to today, which is crazy.
Yeah, yeah, and that also kind of ties in, and you probably see this some in your communities as well. But like the organizations that are still about preserving Scandinavian history and culture and heritage and all that, they're dying off. It's
Yeah.
predominantly people who are like 70 to 95 years old, and it's like
Yeah.
their kids and their grandkids are kind of off or assimilated or not really invested. And
Yeah.
obviously the older folks have more time to dedicate to this sort of stuff, but there's not, it's very much dying out. So there's only, I don't know, maybe there's like 5 of us. So
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot more than that, but
No, I know.
it gets smaller with each generation. So it's like, I don't know, maybe I can just find like a few of us buddies and we'll link up and we'll form our new Kalmar Union here in America.
Yeah, man. It's yeah, I would say it's probably similar for us. Which also means, by the way, if you're listening to this and you're a, I mean, no matter what race you are, there are fraternal like if you're a black guy, there's black fraternal organizations that I'm sure are
Yeah.
full of old dudes that are looking. I'm like, whatever kind of white you are, like, even if you're like a white mutt, there's other organizations that that are great. All of these fraternal organizations, not just ones that are like for racial stuff, I'm racial, ethnic, whatever. Don't join a hate group. I'm talking about I'm talking about these organizations that are fraternal organizations that you can find a mentor in one of these. And
Yeah.
this is something that can help you out a lot. Like, you can find, like, with my experience with the I haven't talked about this in a while, but recording the documentary on the parrot heads, I talk to a lot of older guys, a lot of them business owners. They a lot of them have kids, but a lot of them don't. And this is something that people used to do a lot in history, is they would find, like, you find someone that, this isn't an exploitative relationship. It's a Confucian relationship, right? So it's a relationship of, like, of the younger and the older. Like, there are people that you can learn from, and they can teach you things, and then, of course, they're happy to share and pass on their legacy. Like, you can find mentors in this, and you can find people that will like guide you into life if you don't have that. So, like, I encourage all young people to find an organization like that. And again, I'm not talking about like don't join like a neo-Nazi group or something. Like, these are like, you can join organizations like this that are that have, like, really, really good people who can give you moral advice, legal, like, all types of things. There's maybe even somebody out there who has a business, they need a son to take over, and they don't have one. Or they have one and they don't care about the business that they're in, and you could set yourself up to be in a good position and learn how to be successful. You got to think outside the box today. We're screwed up economically.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, it's great to have any sort of. I mean, people are so disconnected from each other now, and so alienated from each other that just any source of community that's healthy, has some sort of bond deeper than, I like this nerdy subject, or I like this sport. Something that's a little deeper than that. I think that's always great. And then it's
Yeah.
also, some of it comes down to as well. It's like, regardless of whatever your background is, maybe your ancestors are from like 20 different countries, but it's like I think there's still a lot of value in very seriously analyzing, okay, what's the cultural mythology that I'm soaking in, what are the traditions that I'm living in, and
Right.
finding what resonates closest to you, or finding like a set of mythological tools, cultural tools that work well for building a healthy community, building healthy relationships, making yourself into the man or woman that you want to be by like following these ancient patterns. Having that is incredibly valuable. It's like maybe you just, and it doesn't even necessarily matter as much like what your background is, that can inform you, and it's like that informs what is maybe most intuitive for you, for how you're wired. But it's
Exactly.
easy
Yeah.
to, you can still, if you don't feel connected to any particular culture, it's like you should still seek a set of cultural technology.
Like,
That would
and
be
you
my advice.
can just pick one. Like, you can
Yeah.
pick one. Like, if you have, like, for me, 6 of my great grandparents are Irish, 2 are Hungarian. So it's easy for me. Like, it's I'm Irish, whatever. And I like Hungary too. But, like, if your 8 great grandparents are from different places, or if you're just so far back that, like, it doesn't matter to you. Like, a lot of people in the South, a lot of white people in the South just identify as just American because they're assimilated in. It's basically Anglo, really. But, like, or there's a lot of Germans in America who their culture was unfortunately repressed after and during World War I and World War II. But um
Go
you
get some
can just pick.
lederhosen and some ale and get out
Yeah,
there, guys.
yeah, get back into it, man. Like, it's like, you can, yeah, you can just pick one. Like, that's what people did over time. Like, people didn't always identify as Irish, even. Okay, Ireland, 32 counties, all these different places. Like, they used to identify themselves as these different tribes. So this is where a lot of syncretic syncretic religions, syncretic cultures come from. Is that you have, like, we talk about technology a lot on this show, technology as a practical tool. And so there's a lot of political technology. So you have any number of cultures that expand, and as they expand, they, their political organization, their physical technology expands with it. And often it's the physical, literal technology that allows for a new culture to arise. Like, I'll take the Roman Empire, for example. Like, you have the Roman Republic. You have like Romans thinking of themselves as Romans, and over time they expand what is considered a citizen to then like the cities surrounding Rome, and then eventually to all of Italy, and then I think eventually maybe more. But it's like, when you live in a tribe level, versus a chiefdom level, your identity is with your tribe and with the people around you, and then your identity is with your tribe, or I'm sorry, then with the chiefdom, once the technology gets to that level. But then when you're somewhere like Rome and you're able to build roads that spread out, and you're able to have a more complicated culture where, and what the Romans did practically was they had this pantheon of gods, and it was a feature, not a bug, that they could add in the gods of other places into their culture. So then people continue to have these more local identities, but people have multiple identities that interact. So they would have this more local identity, and then that local identity is becomes more it is, in addition, you have this greater identity of being Italian, but you don't lose your local identity.
Right.
So, and then okay, so somewhere like Gaul, like you have Vercingetorix. So when you have Vercingetorix trying to lead the Gauls, he's trying to unite them all together under this identity of this pan-Gallic idea of like, okay, we're all the Gauls, so we're all Celts, so let's get all our Celts together and fight against the Romans. But because these Celtic Gaulish tribes and chiefdoms, they all think of themselves differently. Their understanding of the world is based on their own political technology. It's based on their own methods of organization. They're incapable of looking past these other identities because it doesn't make sense given their worldview. Even they're not quick enough to have that, to form together and understand that they need to fight against the Romans. That's the real enemy, and we only see that in hindsight. But they can't see that because they have all these other traditional things, like they have blood feuds with other chiefdoms. They can't get over it because they were killing, like they might have killed each other's fathers and stuff. That's not just movies back then. That's real.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also like, the worst type of sexual violence and everything like that. Yeah, and that's what you see like in the Western Hemisphere. In the United States, we have like, there were for a long time, there's the Native American Church, which is a pan Native American religion, and it takes from multiple Native American. And when I say Native American, I think most of that has to do with Canadian and the Canada and the United States, Native Americans and First Nations in that area, and their concepts combine all of these different cultures to find one. But that's only possible in a situation where all of the where they can talk to each other, right? Because it wouldn't make any sense for there to be a pan Native American culture when the Native Americans in Minnesota don't know anything about the Native Americans in Connecticut. And the Native Americans in Connecticut are Eastern Algonquin. They're fighting with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. They're their mortal enemy. It's not until those wars stop happening and then the reality sets in that it helps them to bind together into one syncretic total pan religion, that becomes the reality. And then even further than that, now what you have is a global world, and with globalism also comes global identities. And now there's a whole community of people that are broadly indigenous, and that includes people that are as different as the Sami, who are in northern Scandinavia, and the Aboriginal Australians, Incans and Mayans, as well as freaking Inuit and Algonquins and Creek and freaking everybody. It's a worldwide thing. And then they're like, okay, we all have these problems. like we all share a common identity and like being closer to these more traditional ways of life. We you know, a lot of them have hallucinogenic traditions, and they're like, okay, so we can now collaborate with each other based on this new global identity that we have as Indigenous people, because we share similar problems. And that only becomes possible with the broad adoption of technology that allows for an interconnectedness of a global world.
Yeah, and it's also very strange, you know, what is categorized as indigenous versus not indigenous. It seems like there's kind of a lot of politics at play because, you know, the Sami, for instance,
There is.
they haven't been in Scandinavia any longer than the Norse have been in
Right.
Scandinavia. I mean, if anything, they actually migrated a bit later. Obviously, they're still indigenous, you know, just
Right.
as
So
the Norse
I
are.
should, in anthropology, the definition has changed. Like, obviously, the English are indigenous to England,
Yeah.
but like the definition has changed to one of practicality. Like, it's changed to one of like
Hmm.
who practices more. Like the Sami are indigenous in the anthropological definition, which becomes the legal definition, by the way.
Oh, weird.
So it does have implications. Like my field, anthropology, the people who are in charge of that field get to decide what indigenous means, and that does have legal implications in the United States and in other countries. So this isn't nothing.
So it almost sounds like indigenous then has now become something more related to lifestyle than
It literally is.
heritage.
You keep talking, and I'm going to pull it up on the screen.
That's I don't know. That's kind of wild because it's like there's and you see this a lot, especially in as words are changed by academics, often for you know their own kind of ideological agenda. There's the commonly understood definition of a term, and you even see that with something like racism or sexism.
Right, right, right.
Just to take the isms category, there's the commonly understood definition, and then there's the academic or often the weaponized definition of it, which is usually, and I don't know if this term is necessarily weaponized, but it seems like it's you know it's very easy because you'll have academics playing games with terminology that is conventionally understood by the general population to mean one thing, but then is given this special new definition so that it can only fit the desired aims of categorization that academics have.
It required like this is it's required in the realm of academia to define certain jargons and define words within the context of the field in different ways. I think certain times it is a little nefarious, it is subversive. I think with the concept of indigenous in anthropology, it's more on the practical end. I don't think anyone's
Mm,
hiding the fact that they've like been like, okay, yeah, we know indigenous means native, but now we're like, anthropology is a field that really deals with like everyone's super liberal. It's like 97% liberal. That's why I do this, because the niche is conservative cultural anthropology. But it's like they're very open about trying to fix the racist past, and they're also very open, and this is a part that I do very much agree with, of the idea that contemporarily indigenous people do face a lot of issues. So it's like there are shared issues based on like people trying to live in traditional ways that exist
yeah.
outside of the neoliberal global world order. So yes, like the Sami are probably later immigrants, but it is true that like they are for the land that they were on, which for a long time was really only inhabitable by them. You couldn't inhabit it as a Norwegian person or a Danish person without assimilating to their culture, because because it's like tundra. So they changed from being hunter gatherers into being reindeer herders. But both of these, like relatively recently as well, but both of these are like more they're within the concept of indigeneity
Mm.
within anthropology for the sake of helping with contemporary indigenous issues, which is something that I am passionate about, and I think is very serious. Like there are a lot of really a lot of problems with Native Americans, First Nations people, and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, no, I totally am on board with that. I mean, I think that's if you're trying to live in a way that is outside of the you know what someone called the global technological system, it's it's very difficult to maintain any sort of pre-modern lifestyle, or try to even mix in pre-modern lifestyle with modern technology, it's like you get a ton of issues and you get crazy kind of cultural collision. So yeah,
Right.
I'm very empathetic to Native Americans, um, Inuit, people who are trying to hold on to their way of life in a time where that's particularly difficult.
Right.
And it's just a little strange. I think sometimes what happens, maybe this isn't the anthropology side, maybe this is more just journalism, because you get articles that'll often come out, or you'll get statements by NGOs claiming that, say, the English are not indigenous or something, meaning the implication for the reader, meaning they're not native or they don't have a connection to a history there, or they're just
Right.
they're separate from that. And I think that's where maybe the
Yes.
weaponization comes in, is more on the
Yes.
journalistic side.
Yeah, and there's probably anthropologists that claim that as well, but that is not, and that's why I do what I do, because that is not the correct use of this more
Mm.
of this. It is the word indigenous. It's being used in a different way. This is not like, if they're using it like that, they're wrong. Like, this definition should not be used. That is weaponization. That's not cool. By indigenous means native. Yes, the English are indigenous to England, and we can talk about. There's a lot of issues. There's Okay. Here's one example that I've talked about before. Are you familiar with the Maori of New Zealand?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Moriori?
No.
So the
I mean,
Moriori,
I'm not that familiar. I'm like a little bit familiar.
right? So the Moriori were
Are they the ones that do the like war chant
no,
before
well,
games?
no. I would say
Okay.
that the Moriori probably don't do the war chant because they were pacifists. But the Maori have the war chant, and that has been adopted. New Zealand, and I believe this is due to the Maori retaining a much larger percentage of the population to Australia, Canada, and the United States. Um, they they've There's been much more of a blending of indigenous and European culture in New Zealand. They've done it much more successfully than other places.
Hmm.
Australia, Canada, and the United States all had problems with these really, really horrible boarding schools that attempted to erase the culture of the indigenous people there. I think New Zealand had a little bit of that, but definitely not on the same scale. Australia's, Canada's, and the United States were really, really bad. Like, all the worst things that you can think of happened here, in addition to just the baseline, which is that they're taking children away from their parents and assimilating them into a foreign culture. Terrible, terrible, really bad stuff that shouldn't be done to anybody. But that actually speaks to the problem that indigenous peoples face, is that indigenous ways of life, in the sense of, like, when I say indigenous, I'm using this more technical anthropological definition of living in these more primitive, or whatever. That's not really a term we use anymore, but I like to use it sometimes. Less advanced, less complicated, really, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Hey, primitivism is cool. I'm on board.
Yeah. Yeah, like,
It's
people
awesome.
view it as a negative term. They view it as like an inferior thing. I don't. I view it as less complicated, and when
It
things
means
are less
they
complicated.
don't have iPad kids
Right,
watching
right.
Skibidi Toilet at 3 a.m. on their
Exactly.
iPad,
Exactly.
so
None
they
of
don't have
that.
brain
It's
worms.
When I think of something primitive, I think of something that is less, it's less masked in social constructs, which means that it's closer to God. And I spend a lot of time using, traditional tools, doing things like I have a large garden. I have a huge 4,000 square foot perennial garden. I love it. Okay. I love this stuff. But those ways of life are often incompatible with Western ways of living, neoliberal world order ways of living. And so they require that's why they have shared interests, because there are people in all of these countries, even in countries like Ecuador and Brazil, where those are not generally thought of being Western countries, but essentially those countries, their actual the actual literal government was created from Spanish methods, like Spain Spanish. They're not like, these aren't indigenous to that area. Like, the indigenous people did not create that government. They have influences of the indigenous people, but those governments were created in Western methods, and they originally had a racial caste system, which put the white people at the top, and that's changed over time. But that original Western character is still what's the underlying concept of governance. Now, what the hell were we talking about?
Well, you bring that up, and I think that kind of got my mind thinking about, that connects to one of the differences between Scandinavian Americans and Scandinavians in the diaspora versus Irish, which is that the Irish have a much more hostile, certainly skeptical relationship with the English. Versus the Scandinavians were like, oh yeah, they're like our cousins, but we like beat them up 1,000 years ago a few times. They're like our younger brother. They may be more wealthy than we are these days. Well, not these days, but they may have had a grand empire that dwarfed ours at that time.
Right.
But the Swedish Empire was pretty great too.
17th century is one of my favorite eras, so I'm that's the reason why I like the Swedes, because 17th century, that's my favorite century. So
we had a good thing going.
Golden age of them.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah, well, my point being is basically because we never had a relationship with the English where the English were like beating us up or had their boot on us. For us, it's like we don't have any resentment against the English, so it's much easier for us to be like, yeah, we'll assimilate with these guys. They've got very similar connections to us. Old English, Old Norse, we're mutually intelligible. There's a lot of Protestant. They're both Protestant. So we're basically these North Sea rivals, but we're cousins. But we're kind of like peer groups in terms of our geopolitics. So it's much easier for Scandinavians to assimilate and vice versa with the English versus the Irish, who've had this, much more embittered struggle going on for 1,000 years.
So as a Catholic, I don't believe that Catholics should have ever been allowed in the United States. Doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. No, it's stupid. I've said that before. Like the other day, I was like talking with my friend about this, and I think I've said this on the podcast before. I don't belong here. Why am I here? I'm an American now. I'm an American. I'm a U.S. Marine veteran. Why am I here? I shouldn't be here. I should have never been allowed here. The Hungarians, I don't know why they let Hungarians emigrate to the U.S. I don't know why they let Irish Catholics emigrate to the U.S. I don't know why Protestantism started in the first place. Sorry, brother. Well, I know why, but yeah. That's how I feel about it. It's like countries, and we see this a lot now. It's like we started this talking about Ilhan Omar. Like you should not, you can't build a country on increasingly different people. And like there are and it's all the differences. It's racial, ethnic, it's however you define it, whatever you think is important, but racial, ethnic, religious, shared history, it's everything that it could possibly be. All of these different differences. You can deal with a little bit. You got to have a little bit. You have to, because if everyone does the exact same thing, you have no specialization. You have a culture that, it's one track. That's not good at all. That's not good. You can't, everyone's a clone of one another. But I think there has to be like a sweet spot for diversity, and you have to have something that like that keeps that going. And the idea of importing people from like all of Europe is itself already crazy. It's already crazy. And it wasn't something that the United States did until the mid 1800s, I think. Until then, it was all from Germanic countries. They were Protestant and Germanic. The immigration was all from France, Germany, Northern Europe, like Scandinavia.
Took them a while to let in the Scandis.
Did it? Yeah, that makes sense. Did they let in the Germans first?
Honestly, not sure. I know most of the Germans came around. Well, there were like Hessians, and there were some German colonies.
But the Hessians.
Yeah, that was was not on good terms. That was not on good terms.
The Hessians. What people need to understand,
or not militia. They were a private. They were an army hired by the. Yeah.
The Hessians as a people. the British royal family is from Hesse, whatever. It's a state in Germany. This is pre-German unification. So the Anglo-Saxon Brits, yes, they allowed Hessians in. Hessians being the people that were literally their royal family.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, the British Empire did. The Americans not so much. It was a little more shooting at them when they got off the boats.
yeah, of course, because they were wearing British uniforms. But at the time,
Right.
this was like, and this is so stupid because the American Revolutionary War was actually a civil war, kind of.
Yeah.
The American
Yeah.
Revolutionary
An
War
English
was
Civil
more.
War.
The American Revolutionary War was more of a civil war than the American Civil War was a civil war, because the American Civil War was a revolution, and a rebellion. That's what it is. I'm not expanding on that though.
No, that's interesting. I'd love to hear more about that sometime. Yeah.
Oh well, then I will
So
expand. Here's the thing. Oh no, you go ahead. I don't need to.
no. Keep going.
So civil wars, like the English Civil War, they're generally fought for control of the same country. Like they're fought for control of the same territory. The American Civil War is sort of a civil war because it was a fight between different factions within the British Empire. But it was more, yes, it was more like a revolution, a rebellion, in the sense that it was a particular part of that empire splitting off. But they definitely thought about it as like, we're British citizens fighting other British citizens right now. Whereas in the American Civil War, it was a war of secession. Most specifically, it was that it's not a civil war because the South was trying to start its own country. They weren't trying to take over DC. They weren't trying to take over DC and control the entire United States. They were just trying to create their own country. But
that's a good
you know,
point. Yeah.
I think that like this is one of those things where the words that people use when talking about it historically, really they push the they push a political gain. They push a political goal, because when you talk about the American Civil War and you call it a civil war, you're framing it in a way where, oh, it's just two sides fighting, but really it was one side.
The implication is winner takes all.
Yes. But the thing is that the South, we talk about the South, like we say Union and Confederacy. Union just means United States, guys. They just say Union in the context of this because it sounds better than, oh, the United States soldiers were going into the South to another part where all the people wanted to do was start their own country. Oh yeah, they wanted to do slavery, sure. But what did the Union or the United States do as soon as they won the Civil War in 1865? They kept going out west, taking over Native Americans, colonialism. So yeah, if you want to take this moral stance, oh, states' rights to what? States' rights to have slavery. Okay, yes, that's true. But what about the North? What was it the Federals' rights to do? The federal United States forces, they were fighting for their right to continue colonizing and genociding Native Americans in the West, and to control through violence the southern states who wanted to do their own thing. That's what they were fighting for. Not better. Colonialism is not morally superior to slavery. Who's going to argue that? But I digress. Whatever.
Oh no, that's a really interesting examination of it. Yeah, I mean how people frame it. Again, a lot of this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the language people use, the terminology that sets the frame of a conversation. So
right.
What do you see as like the long-term goal or vision with your content, with your channel? I'm always really curious about, the end game people have in mind, or if they have a vision for the next few years, or eventually where they want to get to with stuff.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I want to have a successful, like, I love cultural anthropology. That's my thing. Yeah. Do you know who Louis Theroux is?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So Louis Theroux, he's a bit of a turbo lib now. It kind of sucks, but he is my number one biggest inspiration.
Certainly very talented.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, I grew up like I love cultural anthropology. I'm less into film as you, but I am into it, and that's part of the reason why I'm glad we're connected, is because I want to learn more. But Louis Theroux is my number one biggest inspiration. And Louis Theroux is a guy, if you don't know, for those listening, is that he's a documentarian, a British documentarian who he's had a number of series. You know what? I'll just pull him up here and we can talk about the specific
I'm thinking we
stuff.
really need to hire some British guy like from the Isles to just do the voiceover. That's the challenge. You know, Americans, when we hear the British accent, our brain just goes, oh. Especially if it's the posh British accent, not so much like the Cockney accent, but when we hear the upper class British accent, we go, wow, that's so smart. Please tell
Yeah,
us more.
yeah, seriously. Um, so like Louis Theroux, this is the type of stuff he does. This is one of his series, Weird Weekends. Survivalists. Oh my God, I remember this episode, Weird Christmas. Each of the 4 episodes. So what he does, born again Christians, UFOs, porn. So there's a porn star and survivalists. Like he interviews extreme people, right? And this episode was him bringing all these people together, including a porn star with a born again Christian. It goes as well as you expect. And then these other episodes, Black nationalists, um, these are white supremacists. So he talks to all of these different people, right? And like he talks to all of them, and that's like I have that inspires me a lot because I like to talk to all of these different people. I think that learning about different cultures, like learning about all the different ways that different cultures do things, it teaches me more about the human experience in general, to understand it from all of these different perspectives. And that's not just, I have a lot of fans, like a lot of fans. I have a lot of listeners and people on Twitter that are like, a lot of them are racist. And like, I tell them like, it's okay if you're racist. I'm not, but it's okay if you are. Like my line is violence. I have like communists on my page too. I have everybody on my page, which is what I want. I just
Yeah.
draw
Well,
the
and
line at violence. Yeah.
I think you and I are both in the camp where we're particularly high in the trait openness, but also pretty high in conscientiousness. If you were to take the Big Five personality examination, so
Yeah.
yeah, like guys like us, we love talking to anyone. It's like, and it takes a lot, I think, for us to hear an opinion or hear a take, political or otherwise, where we go, I can't believe you said that, because we're just not like wired that way. We just
Yeah.
it takes a lot for it to hit the shock button in our brain. So it's like we can I think we're well equipped to hear ideas from anywhere outside the box
Yeah.
and kind of sit with them, digest them. We may or may not agree, um, and I think it's
Right.
sometimes it's best not to feel like we have to form an opinion right away. And
Right. Yeah.
that is kind of the model. I mean, sort of that Louis Theroux model to an extent, not with the necessarily turbo libism, but you know, certainly the sitting down with people from, you know, anywhere outside of the box, hearing their beliefs, letting people think through it for themselves, us kind of think through thoughts for themselves. So, I mean, that's kind of with the upcoming project I'm doing. It's basically the model is just go hear things that you wouldn't otherwise hear on the mainstream, hear ideas, and then just let people examine it for themselves just plainly on its own terms. I think there's a
Do you want
huge
to
room in the market for that.
let's go into that in a second, but the other thing that I wanted to say before that, I want to hear more about your project, so don't let me forget that, by the way. I want you to, if you're comfortable, I want to hear everything that you're comfortable talking about it. But like my goal with this is like loving your own history doesn't have to come at the expense of other people.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
I think that like right now there is a like I don't, I think some people get it misconstrued that anybody who is interested in like white history and tradition, and when I'm saying white history, I mean like the specific different aspects of it, like Irish and whatever, like that they have to be hateful towards other groups, or even worse, want to do violence to them. And I honestly feel like there's a way that I hope to imbue some sort of more positive, less violent, more understanding energy into those types of spheres. Because
Hmm.
ultimately, like, I never want to promote myself at the expense of other people. I want to push the idea as well. One of the main underlying underlying beliefs I have is that, like, people are suffering, and I want to understand why, even if that's offensive to people. And I want to understand what the best way to move forward is with that in general for anybody. And so, like, I think that people being more connected to their human past is one way of doing it. And I think that a lot of other people that have this idea have some views that I think are negative, not only to other people that might be the targets of them for violence or God forbid genocide, something like that. But I think that it's bad for cultures to be moved towards. It's bad for them as well. It's bad for the host
Yeah.
culture, and it's bad for whoever their targets are. And I think that through the way that I think about these types of things, that I can, I'm not saying that I can stop a genocide. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I think that the type of content that I make and that I want to continue to make is the type of content that will allow that will show people ways of existing positively in communities, being happy, and all of those ways being not at the expense of other people. And that's kind of the
Yeah.
underlying root of the Parrot Head documentary, where I follow the culture of the Parrot Heads, and I go to their events, and I hear about, and I interviewed multiple people with what the Parrot Head community had done for them.
Yeah, and well, and you probably found as you've been exploring your own people's history and culture that much, and I've certainly felt this way. As as you're exploring your own history more, you've probably become more empathetic and more appreciative of other indigenous cultures and groups around the world because you can
Mm-hmm.
relate to it more now. You're like,
Of
hey, I
course.
understand. I can feel you can feel it now,
Yeah,
and I
dude.
yeah
Absolutely.
yeah
There was a line in a little known documentary. It was a bit of a lib documentary, but it told a good story. They did a good job. There was a group of white people who were helping out. They were like a group of academics. The group grows of, like, who were in the United States trying to, like, do reconciliation with indigenous populations, and they were doing it in ways that I guess had worked in some positive ways. I'm trying to remember, with First Nations people in Canada. And a lot of the documentary showed the clashes of cultures between indigenous culture and white culture, and the connections between them. And one of the scenes, there's this time when, like, all of these white people want to be involved with a ceremony that these indigenous people are doing. And the indigenous people are kind of like, they're trying to hint that, like, they want to do their own thing. Like,
yeah.
they want to do, like, they're doing a lot of stuff with the other white people, but they're like, hey, we want this thing, we want to do ourselves. And at that point, like, these white people who are with them, it felt like they somewhat pushed, they kind of pushed themselves into this thing.
Mm.
And they were interviewing people's perspectives afterwards, and, like, they both had good points. I'm on the indigenous people's side on this one. One of the guys getting interviewed says that, I think that what a lot of white people really like learning about Native American stuff is because they see themselves in us, and
Mm.
that they see a closer connection to the land that they lost a long time ago. And
Yeah.
I was like, wow, like, yeah, that is exactly what it is. I think in essence that guy is very correct, because we all have this history. Every human on the
Mm.
planet. A state-based society is not normal. So I think that Americans and modern people in general, a lot of us look towards First Nations people and indigenous people in general, indigenous being this anthropological definition of people who are living those more primitive ways of life, and, like, look at them
Certainly
and almost
pre-industrial we could yeah.
pre-industrial, yeah, even Amish, even in
Yeah.
Amish people look at them and be like, oh, like, they understand something I don't. They're closer to this animistic, this traditionalist tradition. And I think that we feel that. And that's why I think that indigenous people do have a lot to teach modern people in a lot of ways. And I'm, again, it's that same anthropological definition. Yeah. So
Dude, yeah, no, that's profound.
you think so? Yeah, I thought it was
Yeah.
too. I got to find the documentary and pull it back up. um Maybe do a movie night. But yeah, dude, I heard that and I was like, wow, that is an amazing point. I think that that's definitely it. It's yeah, it's they're closer to it. And it's not about them specifically, but they're closer to it. And that history, they're not doing the same things that my Celtic ancestors did, but it's similar. It's more similar.
Yeah.
It's closer to what my Celtic ancestors did than to what I do today.
Yeah. And I think that's why I particularly find interesting the Vinland sagas in the era when you have Scandinavians with a few Germans. I think there were a couple Irish too on the expedition. It's been a little while since I've read them, so I'll have to go back and reread them. But they go off to the New World and they discover Vinland and they have contact with natives, and some of that contact turns hostile, but they have some trade before. And you get this really interesting period where so much of what we think of as sort of European or colonial history is this sort of clash of one much more advanced, civilization with gunpowder and a level of development that enables them to dominate basically wherever they go on the planet. But when you go back to like the Vinland sagas, it's like there's much closer technological parity. Again, there's it's Iron Age versus something more akin to Stone Age tech in these societies, but it's comparatively a lot closer, and the ways of life were, there's certainly more continuity there. So it's a fascinating time. It's like, okay, one of the alt history scenarios I would love to explore in fiction somehow, if I was to write something, I would probably do an exploration of an alternate history where you do have a much earlier settling and colonization of North America by more Northwest European, including Scandinavian, but also English and Irish, but setting that several hundred years earlier, or 500 or 600 years earlier. I think that would make for a really compelling narrative because you would have that technological parity.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You'd probably also have to change stuff like smallpox doesn't exist in this alt history scenario.
Yeah, I guess I've thought about this scenario before, not in exactly this sense, but in the sense of what if the Western Hemisphere didn't have as many diseases because they didn't have as many domesticatable animals, which over time is what allowed the diseases to happen in Eurasia and Africa, right? They didn't have all the aurochs to do, because the megafauna died in the Western Hemisphere, which we really don't know how.
I miss them so much.
F in the chat.
We gotta find a way.
Megafauna.
Yeah, press F, boys.
But these plants and animals, they weren't domesticatable. I'm going to drop a link to a book that everyone should read, which is Jared Diamond's. I know it's geographical determinism. I know it gets attacked. You should still read it. What's that book called? Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. If the Western Hemisphere does have domesticated animals, and they do have these diseases, and then maybe they go over there first, or maybe the Eurasians go to the Western Hemisphere, pick up some of the diseases, pick up some of those animals, bring them back to Europe, and then the same thing happens to both continents because they split up their diseases. And then what? But it could also be like
everyone dies.
You take the diseases out of it. Well, then, yeah. And then everyone dies. And then maybe 2,000 years later, then they come back. And then they're like, okay, then they meet again. But now they both have now maybe they put in their culture that we're not going to talk to anybody who comes from the seas, comes from the ocean, and we don't know. So they then have cultures that one of them develops antibiotics or something, and they're able to fight against the diseases way better. They come up with something like modern medicine, and then they dominate. But regardless, cool scenario.
Man, that's also getting the gears turned too about how annoyed I am that both of the Avatar films deal with a similar subject, but they deal with it in such a ham-fisted, zero nuance, zero complexity sort of way. Because
I haven't seen them at all.
Oh man, basically it's like you have the humans. They come to Pandora, which is the alien planet, and the aliens are basically.
Okay, never mind. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about The Last Airbender. I was like, one Last Airbender movie, and I didn't see it because I heard it sucked.
The blue people one.
Right.
Not the
I love
Blue
those.
Arrow one.
Love those, obviously, because I love like cultural world building and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, they're
Yeah.
fun. Like, I mean, they've got a lot of great world building elements, cool tech, cool environments,
No
cool
depth though.
animals.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm like, dude, this you could make this easily like a super cool series by instead of having the Na'vi be just basically this amalgamation of all the purest, best traits of indigenous cultures around the world merged into one, plus they're blue and beautiful
Yeah.
and glow in the dark, and they're way taller and stronger than everyone. It's like, okay, well, maybe you could even do some of that, but it's like it would make for a way more compelling story if you had, let's say in the sequel, they had, okay, we're gonna have one of the tribes is still, maybe the Na'vi are still against the humans and don't want to modernize, but you have another tribe that actually does, and it tries to modernize and take human tech, creates its own faction. Maybe you have another one that also takes tech but wants to break away and still remain independent, while another one wants to cooperate with the
Wow.
humans. It's like you could make this so much more interesting
You could
just
make
by
it
having
like
more. Yeah.
you can make it like an Apache Comanche thing where they adopt the
Oh
technology and
yeah.
then they go and then they grow huge. They go across the whole Great Plains.
Yeah, dude. Like,
You
wouldn't that make for a 10 times more interesting story?
It would. It would. Or you could do like a like one of the things where a certain tribe like they get a bunch of stuff from the humans because they get chosen by the humans and then
Yeah.
they're like the vassals of the humans and they're used as a go-between to rule over everyone else. But you
Right.
know
And
why
you
they
could even
won't
do a
do
thing
that?
too. Well, you
Go
could
ahead.
even do a thing too where, let's say one of the tribes that does adopt human tech or tries to integrate more into the new human colony on Pandora. It's like, and again, I'm going just like fanfic here in my head,
Yeah.
but let's say, okay, because they're such an advanced, like their anatomy is so advanced, their genetics are so advanced, they're better at doing this stuff than the humans are. So then the humans are like, oh shoot, we've got these guys basically doing our thing but better. They're like figuring out human technology faster. They're innovating faster. Their minds are a bit sharper than ours. And then now
Yeah.
you have this like crazy clash where they're trying to build their civilization fast enough to rival the humans. I don't know. You could go so many ways, but it's like I think James Cameron, he had this weird because he's like trying to integrate his love of indigenous culture, but he's doing it in a way that's more, I don't know if it's ideological or it's blinded, but he never puts like any negative human attributes or none
You
to a
put
meaningful
some,
degree.
but not on the culture as a whole.
Yeah.
They're like a
Like,
noble savage
but
trope as a whole.
they're like
Individual
so,
Navi do have bad
yeah, but
traits,
they're
but
like
as a
so
whole,
noble. Like the
yeah.
worst traits is like one of them's a little bit too stubborn or one of them is like a little bit hot-headed. And like, but that's
Well,
it. It never goes beyond that. There's no like
those
greed or.
those kids do like try to kill the other kid.
Yeah, that's true. That is because they did try to kill him, get him eaten by
Yeah.
that shark.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. But it never reflects at a higher level.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't reflect at
The
like the
leaders are
highest levels of
never. Yeah.
society. Yeah, and that's dude, that's the thing that I really don't like. Like I I was accused in like education class and look, I was the one who was number one the most interested in indigenous stuff. I was also the only person who would ever bring up indigenous contemporary issues, which I also do on my podcast whenever
Mm,
I bring up indigenous
yeah.
people. And that's based on a conversation I had with a guy like with a native guy. I think it was Mohawk, Haudenosaunee. I'm meaning to get in touch with him. I have his email, but this guy said to me, I was having a conversation with him about history, and he said to me um, like I know you love the history. I really appreciate that, but please, and he like literally is talking to me, and he's like, please, please, please remember that we are still here. And I'm like,
Mm,
damn, you're right. You're
yeah.
right. And I was talking to him from the concept of like, and I told him immediately, I was like, yeah, like, look, I love history. I'm a history buff. So I would talk to like a French guy about French history. But with indigenous people, it is different because like the French aren't in danger of like going extinct. And like I think right now that's not really a problem with indigenous people, but it has been a problem in the past. And culturally and linguistically, it is a problem of them going extinct. So I always just try to bring in the contemporary issues, but I care about that. But in college, I was accused of like, I would talk about the bad traits of Native Americans. Like I would talk about them all the time. I'm like, and I would accuse other people when they're like offended
Yeah.
by bringing this up,
I mean,
that
there's
they just
brutal stuff on the frontier. Like,
very
makes,
brutal.
like, what we would call today, you know, beyond typical war crimes.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
like it was
Seriously.
hardcore. It was hardcore. But that doesn't
And you know,
that stuff doesn't get covered in school.
but like even the Eastern Algonquin Native Americans practiced torturing their prisoners. Like they did, and that was true about like English settlers, but it was also true about other Native Americans. Like they would torture prisoners, and in their culture, the people that they captured had the same culture. They would expect the same fate if they were caught by the other people. And
Yeah.
and the thing is, if you don't want to talk about that, you can't talk about the practical differences of the technology levels, because the thing is that like these Native Americans, we're not talking about Mesoamericans that are living in states. We're talking about hunter-gatherer horticulturalists. And if you're talking about the Haudenosaunee, they're more like a chiefdom. But these categorizations aren't perfect, but they do a pretty good job. Then
Well, I
you don't
remember in
have,
college. Oh yeah, please.
well, they don't have prisons, right? You don't have prisons.
Yeah.
So the entire East Coast practices this thing called mourning wars. So what they would do is they would capture people from other cultures. They would capture other people, and these would generally, but they didn't have to be, these would be younger people, and they would more often than not be women, but they could be men. And you know, there's some sex slavery innate in this by modern definitions, but there's they if they capture you and you're in a war and they're like, and they don't want you into their culture, or they decide you're not good enough, some of them would do this thing called running the gauntlet. You would run through and take a beating, and they would decide if you were strong enough to join them, then they're going to torture you and kill you as a public spectacle. Yeah, so it's but talking
Damn.
about that, you can't talk about the practical differences and why they did that versus why the English did what they did. Like these are practical differences. These are both modern humans. They're both modern humans. If you want to have the conversation that like people are essentially equal at the base level, which I think is not fully true, but it's almost entirely true if you compare human beings to other species, then you have to understand that if 95% of a culture, if a culture accepts something and they're an anatomically modern human, you have to accept that it makes sense in that context, even if it is absolutely horrible by modern standards.
Well, and you
Yeah.
brought up an earlier point too, which is like, hey, we're still here, which reminds me. I mean, it reminds me of all these moments I had in college where they would like at university they would always be like, oh well, we want to acknowledge before we start our talk, our concert, that we're on stolen land, and I would always sit there and I would be like, what? That doesn't. You're not actually helping anyone. You're not
It's a
actually helping them.
platitude.
So
And
like, are you
it,
gonna give the land back?
it's a
Like,
lie,
is
dude.
that? I'm not saying you necessarily should, but it's like, are you gonna try to find some? Like, are you just do? You're obviously just doing this to like make yourself try to seem virtuous and then like shame the rest of us. It's
Right.
like you're not actually trying to find some sort of solution or some sort of constructive way to help.
It's
Uh,
it's all
help
surface
native.
level stuff. James
Yeah.
Cameron's like Avatar is surface level understanding of indigenous rights. It's surface level understanding of indigenous culture. It's all the baseline Hollywood that's been exported everywhere. So there's no nuance in it. They don't give like a human perspective to it. And with the base level, like Ben and Jerry's, for example, they made an acknowledgement like, oh, we're on stolen land. They literally say this.
We're gonna have the
Um,
stolen Native Americans flavor of the week.
yeah, exactly. And like Mia, the Native American artist or the Native American drawing on the Land of Lakes box, like Ben and Jerry's is on specific Native American land that
Yeah.
can be tied to a Native American tribe that is still existing. And the
Do you
tribe,
have a? Yeah. Sorry, I keep
the,
interrupting. I'm
no, that's
terrible.
okay. That's okay. Last sentence. That tribe, and I'm interrupting you too. It's what we're doing. That tribe, Ben and Jerry's goes, oh, we're on stolen land. And then that tribe is like sends a message to Ben and Jerry's. They're like, hey, like, what's up? Like, you said you're on stolen land. Like, what are you going to do? Like, and even if it's not, number one, if you say you're on stolen land, you don't mean it if you're not going to give it back, because if something's stolen, it means it should return to its rightful owner. You didn't steal it. It got conquered, whatever. It's these terms. But like, don't say that if you're not going to at least give something to the Native American population. And that doesn't have to be land. Since you legally own it, you didn't steal it. You're lying. It doesn't have to be land, but maybe do something for them, man. But they just ignore them. They just ignored them. They didn't respond at all. And maybe they've responded since, so I shouldn't say that because I read this a long time ago, but I doubt it. I doubt it.
And like, there probably are steps that we could take that are mutually beneficial. That it's like, okay, maybe there's some way that we can work on projects to, I don't know, restore the quality of the land that we're on. It's like everyone here is kind of like in a lot of America is suffering under the sort of ugly urban sprawl, terrible architecture, living in unhealthy ways, disconnected from the land. It's like maybe there are things we can do to all get back to a place or move forward to a place where we're actually, you're enabling tribes to live in a more sustainable, thriving way, and also a way that's like beneficial to some of the rest of us who are here in the U.S. as well. I mean, are there kind of solutions that you've heard or that have come into your mind that might be worth exploring?
So
I don't think we need to treat it as a zero-sum thing where
Right. So in the context of Ben and Jerry's, I don't know, but in the context of a more broad thing, right? So it's a liberal take, common, that they're like that for sustainability we need to learn from indigenous cultures. But I am here to tell you that that is true. And it's true for a number of reasons. So like we talked earlier about how like languages and technologies and belief systems, they come out of thousands of years of tradition. And we might not know the literal reason why these types of things happen. We might not know like if there's a fence somewhere, you don't know what its purpose is, you don't tear it down. So it's like, because we can't define or understand the reason for certain things in our culture doesn't mean they're not there for a reason. And it's just the new methods that we have of viewing information attacks those old things. So what I'm saying is, I'll give an example with food, with something like the Mediterranean diet. Pretty much any indigenous diet, and when I'm saying indigenous diet, I mean like an indigenous food culture. I'm including the Mediterranean food culture in that. Any food culture, like the Inuit food culture is almost entirely meat-based. So you can study the Inuit food culture to understand what maybe a meat-based diet would look like. But the indigenous Inuit food culture is based on like, it's based on a lot of seafood, a lot of fatty animals that have high fat.
It's like, I've heard it's like basically ketogenic just due to the nature of the ratios of fat. Their macro split.
Right. It is. It absolutely is. Basically, it's ketogenic. And so food diets throughout the world, based on their different environments, different foods come about to serve the nutritional needs of the population. And the food cultures of these places and these recipes lost over time. Like have you ever seen that famous video of there's a black guy, like a pastor or something, he's yelling, he's like, the children, we're losing recipes. And like that,
I haven't heard that one.
It's awesome. I should pull it up next time you're saying something. But like, it's a real problem. We're losing recipes. We are losing recipes, man. And those recipes were passed down through like generations of women, mostly over time.
Yeah.
And those recipes and the different diets changing from the different from like the different seasons and everything, those naturally over time, they came to feed your nutritional needs naturally. That's just what happened. They didn't fully understand it through the methods of food science like we do today, but not really, because that just doesn't work. But they naturally serve the needs of a culture. And then you take people out of this natural environment, you take them out of their indigenous, their native location, like even like somewhere like Italy, and the ingredients aren't the same, the culture is not the same around it. Like there's not like the same meat-based consumption in the United States. We like in the US, we eat mostly poultry. In a lot of the Middle East and Italy, they eat more pork. Like certain places, they eat more seafood. And all of these local diets over time, they create something that in aggregate serves the nutritional needs of a population. So you can't just create it out of nothing. And they're very diverse, right? So a ketogenic state, you don't need to be as a human in a ketogenic state, but you do need to be feeding your nutritional needs in some way. And there's just multiple ways to do that. There's a bunch of ways to skin a cat. And like, and it also is true that some of this is based on your ethnicity. And the most obvious example of that would be something like lactose intolerance. Like I'm very lactose tolerant, okay? Milk gang. But like if your ethnicity, there is more variation in what diet you should be eating based on your genetic material than people are willing to admit, and that's because it's taboo to talk about.
Yeah, I'm very LaCroix tolerant.
Yeah, I love that.
Chug this stuff.
It's awesome. You're drinking LaCroix itself would be like it's you're signaling upper class behavior as well, and you're close. Yeah. No, it's a thing.
I can't help just being a natural aristocrat. I try my best, but you know, can't help it. Can't help it.
And look at me, I'm not that. I'm doing my own thing though. Like,
it's tough to be a trillionaire out here. You know, I've got my Bugatti getting fixed this week.
Very nice. Yeah, I drive a Subaru.
Nice.
It is. I'll tell you afterwards. I'm not saying that on the air. Remind me about to say that. Did you have something else to say?
No. I think that covered it. Yeah. No, this will be fun to listen back to in my fleet of Bugattis when we get those out.
Yeah. Wait one second though. We're not done yet. I want you to talk about your documentary.
Sure.
But then I want you to talk about your documentary.
Let's hear the clip. All right, Jamie, you got that clip ready?
Jamie, yes. I'm going to make the guys on 5 Till Midnight tonight call me Red Man. All right, I'm just going to play this.
All right, let's
This is the one.
Oh my God, this is what's wrong with today. The young ladies today, they're not learning from mom how to cook recipes. And now,
dude, that's what's wrong with our culture. He's right.
Dude, can you play that again?
Yes.
That's amazing.
What's wrong with today? The young ladies today, they're not learning from mom how to cook. We're losing recipes. And now, oh my God.
We're losing recipes.
We're losing recipes. I love the energy he says with that. But like, he's awesome. Like, I think it's funny to people because people are like, haha, he's laughing about this dumb thing. He's so serious. But like, what's being lost in that is that he's not articulating it explicitly. But what he's getting at is that like, we're losing culture. Like losing those recipes is losing culture. Like
everything is becoming bland, processed. You know, it's airport. It's
if you talk to like a lot of, like I grew up in a place with a lot of Irish, also a lot of Italian. You talk to people, people's grandparents are eating different stuff. Like you talk to an older Black person in the South, they're eating okra and chitlins and collard greens. Those things they meet a lot of the nutritional needs that a lot of our processed food doesn't meet today. There's a reason you eat that. And then we look at chitlins, we're like, oh, that's disgusting. And then there's like, since it's a cultural thing, there are certain Black people our age who still eat them, but I think the majority doesn't. But for a long time, this was a cultural food that a lot of people ate in the region of the South, not just Black people, but others as well. A lot of things that are just Southern get lumped in with Black culture because of Black people leaving the South after the Civil War, and they were doing things that were broadly Southern. And then white people in the North associated them with the South, like fried chicken. Fried chicken's a Southern thing, but fried chicken was also probably invented from the syncretic it was probably invented from the French dish chicken française, grown or being cooked by Black. I think while they were still enslaved cooks, chefs. Like merging that with their own methods. I don't remember specifically. I did a thing about it a long time ago. Okay.
That's awesome. Yeah. No, I think that's totally the
Your
case. There
documentary.
are these kind of lost. Oh yeah, we can jump to that.
No, you can say whatever you want about that, but if you have nothing to say on it, that's okay.
No, I was just filling airtime, to be honest.
Oh yeah. So I'm ready. Tell me about your
Awesome.
documentary, and that can be our last thing. So then just tell me where you want me to put, like what you want me to link to in the episode.
For sure, yeah. So working on a documentary now. I was just in DC last week, filming some footage. Um, it's pretty. It's a little hard to explain because the nature of the documentary, as it exists right now, is still largely in a conceptual stage. I have guests and interview subjects that I'm reaching out to. Some I know I'm able to get. Some are still pretty up in the air. So the roster of who's going to be in all the interviews is a little bit fluid right now. So, and that'll shape the nature of the documentary quite a bit. But the general gist of it is identifying and following along and interviewing figures who are on the avant-garde of the art scene, the intellectual scene, the political scene.
What does
Guys who
that
are
mean?
basically,
What is
it's sort of
avant-garde mean?
like the avant-garde. It's an art term. It's basically like the advanced guard. It's people who are on the outside but pushing more cutting edge artistic ideas. In this case, bringing it more into the intellectual side. So some of it looking to get some artists on as well. But it's basically finding people who are pushing the edge, who are on the outside of the box, pushing very interesting ideas that aren't you wouldn't normally come across in the mainstream, and basically understanding, okay, what's the nature of your thoughts, how like what are your goals, what is your life like, and then just kind of exploring these ideas and trying to do it from a value neutral perspective. So it's coming at it where I'm not putting too much of my own thought into it, although a little bit of it's coming from the Christian Midwest perspective here, but it's basically just kind of trying to be as open minded as possible and hear ideas from figures, especially figures who are influential on the internet. You know, some would even say like dissidents, so forth, who are putting out ideas that are really innovative. Maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right, but just kind of exploring them and giving a space to hear them, and then also hear some of the opposition to those ideas, to just let people kind of digest it and figure out, you know, okay, what's going on, what's like this world of really fascinating art and ideas and culture scene that's outside of what I'm going to hear on TV or get from my big broadcaster or get from, you know, conservative radio or from, you know, mainstream, you know, left of center news. So it's like something, it's basically just trying to aggregate and find people who are putting forward the most interesting ideas and culture movements and presenting that in a way that's like easy for people to share around.
That's awesome, man. I really like that idea a lot. I
So
really do.
yeah, I'll work on a way to explain it in a more condensed way. I have a website that it's gonna be a crowdfunded project. So if we get up to 25K in funding, that'll enable us to put the whole documentary out for the public at no charge. And then, but yeah, there's an announcement video that'll be coming out hopefully pretty soon. We're just waiting on getting some of the website last details set up and the payment processing ready to go, and then from there we'll be able to launch the fundraising for the project. I've already been out doing some B-roll. I'm doing a lot of the pre-production right now, working with some collaborators on the project. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be a lot of fun, but
Okay.
it's going to be a ton of work to make happen.
And I'm probably oh, excuse me. And I'm you've asked me to be in it, which
That's
I
right.
appreciate.
Yeah, I'm very
I probably
excited.
got some other people that you might be interested in, so we'll talk about that off the air. But by the time this episode comes out, that'll probably be out because this won't come out for 2 or 3 weeks. If you can get it out by then. Don't worry about it too much. It's not like I have a massive audience here, but there's definitely overlap, and it would benefit you maybe a little bit to have that out. I don't know.
Yeah, so if this is out after I've launched the website, it's just nordhugr.com, nordhugr.com, and
Okay.
that's where you can find details about it.
Awesome. Okay, and I'll link to that down below if it is. And I'm also going to link to Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel below.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Patreon's $2 a month, early and unedited episodes, and more exclusives to come. Guns, Germs, and Steel is linked in the description. Highly recommend the book. Next week is a guy who moved from Jersey to Kyrgyzstan. You can get that right now, unedited, on the Patreon, $2 a month.